There used to be tons of people over here in between classes. Nobody here.
Like the rest of the country, universities shut down to stop the spread of coronavirus.
It feels like a little bit apocalyptic.
There's practically nobody here. This is the center of campus.
Everything's closed, dining halls are closed, gyms are closed.
I never would have thought that I would see campus so dead.
I live in these apartments, and there's signs all over campus with reminding us to social distance all around.
Student life may be long gone, but some students stayed behind.
Does it feel like a college campus still?
I wouldn't say so because, college campuses are supposed to be packed with students, and right now it's just like dead in silence.
I have 5 housemates typically in the house, and I'm all alone now. They all had to leave. I do have a twin sister, so I've never been alone in my life.
Do you feel like a college student right now?
No, it feels like summer. Social gatherings can't happen, so it's like we Zoom and we party over Zoom.
All the buildings are dark inside, and there's just no one on campus, and it's very, very eerie feeling.
Stony Brook University has literally transformed from school to hospital.
Those are the 4 tents built by the Army Corps of Engineers.
I'd say like 2 weeks ago when I was playing soccer, they haven't had anything built up. But then like in 2 weeks, it's just like that. They built like all these 4 big white tents.
Thousands of students across the country weren't able to get home during the outbreak. Donald is an international student from Hong Kong.
If I go home, after all this blows over, I might not be able to come back.
Ivana stayed for financial reasons.
If financial circumstances were not a thing that I had to think about, definitely I would have gone home. I wish I was with my family right now. I wish I was getting annoyed by my sisters.
Kyle didn't want to risk exposure traveling back to South Carolina.
I also didn't want to go through an airport just to risk giving it to my parents.
But now they're dealing with unexpected challenges alone.
This used to be our dining hall.
You basically form a single file line, and then you go through the line, and then they serve you food over the counter, and then you have to take it back home.
I'm writing my thesis right now, and I have a bunch of library books I need to get back, and I need to figure out how I need to give those back.
I have student loans, and I'm paying now for what was supposed to be in-class learning that's now online, which is a fraction of the cost.
My friends are usually walking towards me when I come out of classes.
If I don't have my friends, I don't feel well.
Still, they're finding creative ways to cope.
I ordered a butterfly garden. It just got here today. So I'm going to be growing some caterpillars.
What?
Yes. Just some company.
When I do take walks at night, usually just because I try to avoid people, I see some lights, and it makes me hopeful that there's other students here going through the exact same thing that I am.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.